Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Selling to Healthcare. You probably haven't heard my voice before. That is because this is a new series that we're starting. And to give you a little background on who I am, I don't have experience in the healthcare space specifically. I've ran my own agency and PR firm for the past 6 years, and I've worked with Lisa intimately in some different projects where I've really been able to see under the hood on her business in ways that I found very fascinating because I've been able to see just how much expertise she really has in her industry and niche. And I'm really excited just to dive into some of the concepts that she shared with me today that she's learned through her 30 plus years in the industry and by building a company that actually sells to hospitals via healthcare and it's successfully exiting that company in this space. So it's rare that you'll find someone with this much knowledge that also wants to freely share that via content. So Lisa, I'm just really excited to do this with you. And yeah, did I miss anything else that you wanted to say about your expertise and
No, that was great. And Gavin, I want to share a little bit about you because yes, it's been a wonderful time that we've been working together on several projects. And I hope through this project, people get to hear more from you because you are an expert in PR. And I'll share a little bit maybe at the end of this episode or the next about hospital sales AI, which you are also the mastermind behind that and a lot of other great work. So hopefully people will reach out to you, but you're going to share how people can reach out to you at the end. But no, this is great. I just one thing I want to say is that initially I thought I would only do 5 podcasts, and I had in my mind kind of the definitive authority on selling to healthcare. But it turns out that 2 things happened. More topics came up, of course, can't be the definitive. And second of all, I had so many people reach out to me. In fact, even today, I had someone reach out and really they'd found so much value. And I love that people are getting value. And so thank you for doing this with me so I can continue to share, things that are coming up for my clients or things I see. So this is great. Thank you.
of course, yeah. I mean, again, I'm excited to learn myself today, as I'm sure, the person listening is also looking forward to hearing what you got to say and diving into it. So with that being said, to give everyone some context, Lisa shared with me her framework called the 5 forces for driving every hospital decision. Lisa, could you just touch a little bit briefly on what that is before we dive into it and how you've even figured out this framework?
Sure. One of the things for myself when I had my boutique consulting firm and I was competing against a lot of these large like big healthcare consulting firms, like billion-dollar firms or just global firms, that I had to figure out how to compete, like how to get the attention of a C-suite person. And so I leaned heavily on thought leadership. I leaned heavily on immersing myself into all aspects of healthcare. So it wasn't just what I was looking at, which was cost. It was all the things that surrounded cost too. So, and what I ended up understanding was that revenue cycle was important to cost, that efficiency, and what we'll talk about today, particularly, is reimbursement, right? So, it's how do hospitals get paid and what does that mean? So, just as a little, it's a little bit of backstory is that because I was so immersed, whether it's curiosity or survival, or, I needed to really, differentiate, I leaned on my differentiation on having deep, deep, deep expertise where I truly could go in, speak with the CFO, CEO, or be able to at least converse, right? Understand and have a great conversation, or sometimes even maybe teach them and things that I'm reading or maybe that I've thought about differently. And so that ended up being the differentiator. Truly, probably one of the biggest differentiators was that thought leadership, but it's not thought leadership for the sake of it. It's really like, how do you get those nuggets? Like, how do you synthesize? How do you compare? So the 5 forces, I ended up coming up with this because these are things and these are aspect forces that drive decisions, right?
Mhm.
The C-suite or executives, these are things that face them every day, in one way, shape, or the other. So when I started to think about now for my clients, what forces impact them, so they're trying to get into selling to the C-suite or selling to different departments. What are the elements that they could learn deeply about, or we could do that together so they can build thought leadership, or they can, align with what they're selling. So to answer your question, I came up with these 5 forces, which I believe is pretty complete, with which are the 5 that impact the C-suite.
100%. And what I think is really cool about diving into this is I find that when you are in an industry where there's a lot of people who want to sell to that industry because it's, a really lucrative and good industry to be in, you'll find a lot of people attempting to get into it. And one of the ways that the decision makers can instantly tell if somebody actually is an expert or not is by the questions they ask. Because through those questions, they're like, oh, dang, this person really understands what's going on. And like you're saying, that helps build perception that this person is a thought leader. It helps build trust. So I think by really understanding these 5 forces today, yeah, the listeners are really going to be able to also apply that just from the questions to, hold that frame better in their conversations with decision makers. Let's dive into the first force. You said it's alignment to payment models.
Yes. So particularly more now than ever, but when I was running by one of the payment models from CMS, primarily I'm going to be speaking about Medicare, right? Because Medicare is the largest payer. So these are CMS uh, payment models. So particularly when I was running by, CJR was one of the payment models that came out. It was for joint replacement. And so that was a real big one, a little bit of a shocker for everybody, because now it introduced how a hospital would have to get paid for a whole episode. So that would be before the surgery, during the surgery, and then in that episode, it was 90 days. And everything was covered, had to be covered, and the hospital would get an episode payment. So it really was a transformation. And so when I really started digging in, and we did do some advisory around, primarily around the cost side in the middle, I really got to see, like, literally this particular model, right? This was like, I think it was like 1,100 pages. So I read it, and I went through. We didn't have AI then, like you had to
That's
print,
crazy.
and it was 2 binders, right?
Yeah.
So what by reading it, rereading, highlighting, and immersing myself into it, because I was, like, I was doing webinars, I was consulting on it. I was panicked that someone would ask me a question I didn't know, but what ended up happening was I ended up knowing more than most people, because most people didn't read 1,100 pages of a regulation. And so that was an eye opener for me, as I started to talk to CFOs and how they started to think about that payment model. And I realized that, this was very different in how they would have to approach it. They'd have to approach it clinically, financially, and operationally. And I always that's another model I use, a CFO model, because everything in a hospital usually drives decisions, like there's a clinical component, there's a financial and an operational component. But so now fast forward to 2026, we have so many different models. I think it's about up to 11 now and more coming. And so let's speak about CMS Teams, the team bundle payment, which is 5 episodes, very similar to CGR. It's a 30-day post-op that the hospital will have to manage the care for, but it's all aspects. So they have to align with physicians, primary care, post-acute care. The whole goal, and I only go into depth into one because we've got other forces, but for teams, Medicare always gives the goal for their payment model, the outcome, the problem they're trying to solve. So if you go to the CMS site and you're going to teams, they'll say what the problem is, what they're solving for, and what they hope the outcome would be. So they're very clear. And in the case of team, this is solving for fragmented care. So fragmented care is very costly. So it means that physicians or the hospital or clinicians are not coordinating with the patient. And so fragmented care means primarily patients get readmitted. It means that maybe, there could be just a whole lot of, they're not going to their doctors. Maybe they're taking too long to recover, or there could be a number of different aspects, but primarily it's going to be readmissions, patient satisfaction, and also how they score. Patients score in different ways. Do they understand their discharge instructions, which is so important. I remember speaking about this years ago. Like I can tell you, I don't know if you've ever been, you know, released from an OR, even ER, and you get the discharge instructions, you're just not in the frame of mind. You get home and you're like, well, what happened? What do I do? And that transition of care really is the point that leads to a lot of challenges. So I say all that is that the hospitals are focused on how they get paid. What are these payment models, right? So if they have to now take into consideration not just surgery costs and everything on their four walls, and they got to take into consideration things that come after their four walls, and how do they do that? Well, guess what? They're going to have to buy for that, right? They're going to have to buy technology. They're going to have to buy training. There's all these things. And so again, we'll go back to team, what if you're a provider? My recommendation, this is why it's force one. Look at all the payment models that exist, right? So whether there's a site neutral reform, access is coming out. The rural healthcare fund is huge right now. Every single state will have access to rural fund. Now teams and also there's a readmissions act that's already in place. And some of these have a double, triple impact. So if I'm selling into hospitals, or for that matter, even an ASC or even in physician practice, if you understand all about these payment models, now you're equipped to, first of all, be able to say how you can offer value, right? How or understand and really, well, I understand your challenges now. And, I've been reading about teams, and these are 3 ways that we can support teams. Or even if your product doesn't support team, maybe you can just be able to you can converse. You said it earlier, right? Just being in the room to ask questions, Dr. Lear, how are you addressing, post-acute care? Like, what is your practice doing about it? And maybe it's a great conversation or whatever or have you thought of, XYZ? So I'll pause for a minute. It's definitely important if you're going to be seen as an advisor. Questions are the key. And 2 last things on this. I wish more companies would do this, really dive in. I think this is where the entry into meetings with the executives lie, is here. And a lot of people want I want to send an email, I want the LinkedIn, all those things are important, the sales strategies, but this is hard work. But that's why I leaned into this one first.
100%. And I feel like, as people hear that, of course, we know that the hard things need to be done in order to see success. And with how AI has helped automate some of these things and make them a bit easier for us, would you say now, for people listening to this, that if you were to go back when you had to read that 11,000 page, reports, like, would using AI to summarize that be good enough? Or would you say, you don't think it would actually be good enough in
That's a
today's?
great question. So I think yes and no.
Mm,
So, because I'm going to give you a real world example. So
mhm.
yes, I do think you could get a good summary enough to you can converse in, right? You could have it's in teams, 700 plus hospitals, 5 episodes. You could really have a nice explanation. I guess it's how you'd prompt, right? So I would definitely, the prompting would matter. Funny story, I was on a call with an executive and I was sharing an aspect of team and saying that there's a Medicare beneficiary allotment, meaning that the patient, the beneficiary, could get an incentive if it's tied into something to do with their care coordination. And I said, I find it interesting with CJR, they had the same thing. And now with Medicare, or now with teams they do. And I would love for hospitals to find out how to use that incentive, right? It can't be an incentive to lure you to the hospital. It's an incentive to say, look, if you come here, you're doing a cabbage procedure, you can get a Whoop watch that will be able to track or something, And I'm like, I would love, and there's some requirements to get it, to meet the financial requirements. Can't be too expensive. But anyway, so I'm on the call and the person, I guess, hadn't heard, like, I hadn't heard of that. And they must have typed into ChatGPT and then replied back and said, Lisa, I think you're wrong about that. I don't think that's true. Is that, I just checked with ChatGPT. There's no beneficiary payment. And so, respectfully, I'm like, oh, let me just send it to you afterwards. I went on the Medicare site. I downloaded it. I had the specific one page to benefit, and I sent it. So you know, could it be good enough, Gavin, to get an understanding and prompt your way through it? Yeah. If you really want to be an expert, and be so conversational, I don't think you can. What's your experience?
Well, if it were something like 11,000 pages, I would say if you are going to use it with AI, you got to break it up.
Yeah,
And you got to
good
like
point.
essentially chunk it up into like 100 pages at a time, which obviously is a lot of uploads to AI. If I want to go more than 200 at a time if you want really in-depth, good feedback. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. You got to be careful not to, again, you might get 70, 60% of it, but obviously that extra 40, 30% can really make a big difference when you're in these conversations.
But you bring a good point. I'm glad you're sharing it. You're right. If you broke it up and you took it and you really were studying it as you broke it up, yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a great, point. Like there's so much volume and there's so many payment models. That's a great place for companies to start at. Pick one model, take only chunks of it and ask questions and learn. I agree with you. That's actually great advice for everyone's listening.
Well, thank you. And so this makes a lot of sense to me how you're talking about, essentially CMS dictates a lot of how hospitals are deciding what to buy and focus on because like you said, it is their main revenue source. What would you say is the biggest incorrect assumption that you see hospital sales reps making about how CMS is impacting hospital decisions?
Good question. I didn't. I think I'll bucket it into two things. I I I think the biggest assumption sometimes is that look, hospitals get paid for everything. Like they're going to get paid. They're going to have a there's a DRG, there's an episode payment. They're going to get paid, and they're always looking for ways to like maybe if there's more complexity. Oh, that you can add. The hospitals can make more money. I think that the biggest misnomer is that hospitals make more money than they do. I've heard it
Mm,
myself over and over, and I don't think the sales reps know how much at risk hospitals are for all kinds of things. So, if something goes wrong as a readmission, I think we're hearing more about readmissions, but even patient satisfaction, I think the reps are hearing more about that. But I think the biggest issue is that, the awareness of that hospitals are so constrained by how they get paid, and now they're overlapping and it's
yep.
making it even harder.
That makes a lot of sense. And my last question on this force is really I'd love to know just kind of like an example where you've worked with a lot of different clients, even yourself have sold into the industry, plenty of times. What would you say is an example where you feel like you or a client were pretty much doing this wrong or missing the mark on this force and how you either corrected it yourself or helped your client correct that?
Yes. So, first of all, I think the one big correction is not including this in their, in their materials. They can't include it in every material, but just not having it in the materials to actually make those connections, right? But I think that's the problem. I think, and for me, there's multiple places where sales reps have to present their product, solution, technology. And I think every single person, you've got to tell that story in somewhat of a different way. And so I think that's it as well, right? So, for example, when I used to sell non-labor cost savings, my message to the CFOs might be one, my message for the physicians might be another, the CNO.
Yeah.
And I also took some research. So I'll tell you one quick story.
Hmm.
We might have to break this podcast up into two episodes, but,
Yeah.
but I found a study where it talked about physicians just understanding the items that they used in surgery and giving the details and the cost, not doing anything else, just giving them the data. And basically the shift was about a 13.5% shift of the group that saw it versus a group that didn't. And I sailed, and that story allowed me to use that with physicians, right? And differently, like for a CFO, that may not resonate as much as like showing them more P&L work. But with a physician, they're saying, "Oh wow, Lisa, that does make sense. I wish I got the data." My point in all this is, I think the biggest mistake is not including more about these models into what they're selling into hospitals, because virtually probably everything at this point maps into those models. So that's a big mistake, and not giving them that alignment and how they could help, right? Assuming that the hospital already knows that their product can be used in a different way, like would get value in helping them solve this. We have to put it together for them. So last point, I had a client who primarily was, and this happens frequently. So like looking to sell into like a department level. And, I was able to really show them that while there is a department level sale, and that's important, there is also a CFO sale. And so, but it's getting that jump. It's like, well, here are the three things, and this is how you get to that executive level messaging. And so changing that to a financial executive messaging has been very, very different. I mean, and so I think we have to still sell at the department level, and we also have to figure out how do we message on that executive level. And I think people don't spend enough time doing that. It's easy to do it on the department level, really hard to do it on the executive level.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautifully said. And I think you hit a lot of depth there that, people will be able to apply to what they're, presenting and selling. So the second force that you had mentioned to me is alignment to regulations, essentially being able to turn compliance into something that can generate you appointments from an urgency standpoint and sales. And yeah, I'd love for you to dive into that force and how that helps dictate hospital decisions.
Yeah. So regulations is a big one, right? So, I mean, you could think about even tariffs. That's the big one we're all hearing now. And so I think that, tariffs, unfortunately, are probably not, it haven't seemed like they're getting better. Right. And so, I think that, that's a conversation that reps have to have, either that they're unfortunately telling hospitals how that they raise prices, or maybe other companies being able to come in and now show, look, even though there are tariffs, we're taking that burden, or companies that have been really looking forward to getting into hospitals, and maybe they have a cost advantage and they're like, look, tariffs, we're, we're still going to save you money. Like, and so you could use a regulation and use it to your advantage. And I think if I were in that space now, I would probably flipping the script and saying, if I had been really struggling to maybe get in for whatever reason, I would be showing value in how I could support or eliminate that burden of now the hospitals having all this additional cost because of tariffs. So that's one example. I think that, there's price transparency. So what happened a couple of years ago, the government mandated that the hospitals have to put all their or certain pricing, or their CDM, what they charge on, like, I think there's like a couple of hundred different procedures on the website. So that was a regulation. And so a lot of hospitals didn't comply or partially complied. And, could a vendor come in and say, we can help you to meet that regulation for sure, or maybe do it precisely the way they should. And, they've got to, hospitals have to show their negotiated rates, like what they negotiate with managed care payers. So it's a risk. Now everybody could see it. And so now it causes other problems, because like different payers can see what other payers are paying. And maybe if they're paying high, now they come in, at now they can negotiate lower. So, that was a big issue. You have cybersecurity, you have the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So all these regulations, like, how do you help them, mitigate the risk? How can you use as advantage maybe to get into the hospital? So those are kind of some ideas, just, and listen, regulations is it's very different than the payment models. But it is something that's mandatory. So very similar as the first force.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, yeah, you hit on that very thoroughly. Honestly, it's very clear to me. And Yeah, just to reiterate too, because I can't remember if we touched on this earlier, but correct me if I'm wrong. It is extremely important for every single rep to hit on at least two out of these five total forces when they are giving a presentation. Otherwise, there's almost not enough pain to, out of all the different things for them to focus on, for them to want to seriously consider what you're presenting. Well,
100%. If you think about it, right, like even Force One with the payment models, and if you're bringing in a solution for that really helps support them to succeed. Listen, Force One doesn't mean they lose money. There's a big chance that if they do it right, they can make more money, which actually speaks to this Force Three I'm going to speak about in a moment. But if they've got two and you can have two or three, you're right, Gavin. It does make it more powerful because now you're hitting on like for them, they have goals and things they have to achieve, and now you're helping them achieve more than one.
100%. So yeah, even briefly, I feel like touching on some of these, even if it's not your main one, like you're saying, if you can find a way to get it into your presentation to get them considering that, it just becomes more of a no-brainer out of all
Agreed.
the things that are screaming for their attention for them to focus on. But like you said, how Force 3 is related, which is alignment to aspirations. I'd love for you to dive into that and let us know how you found that has been helpful for you to sell to their ambitions and not just the problems that they're having at the hospital.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways, but look, every department leader, every executive, every C-suite, they have their own goals, they have their own milestones they have to achieve, even how they, incentive compensation, incentive comp. And so, or just aspirationally, you know, they have a reason they want to get a promotion. So years ago, I gave a speech at a hospital association meeting, and primarily all CFOs except for like a few VP of finances. And this one VP of finance, after I spoke, wanted us to, have a meeting and later brought us in. But his aspiration was to become the CFO. So
Mm,
if he could, kind of bring a company in and help reduce their costs and, really be seen as this change maker and transforming costs, he was probably in line anyway, but certainly this was another way he could prove that he could now go and fill this CFO position. And for when that happened, it was when I was like, I get this. Like this is a perfect case scenario of people that have aspirations and they're going to bring your company in to help them achieve their aspirations.
mm,
So there's one, and look, people want to be successful. Like, they want to be the innovator. That's how they're wired. And so
yeah.
you will meet aspirational people at the C-suite or the executive level. And how do you help them achieve their goals, right? And I think whatever that may look like. I've always enjoyed working with aspirational executives because it's always the what if, what's possible. And so once you're working with them, there's always opportunity then to expand
Yeah.
and do more.
100%. I mean, I think something you're illustrating here is that you're really not you're selling to hospitals. Yes, you're solving the hospital's problems, but ultimately you're still selling to people who
100%.
have egos. There's politics, and I'm not even saying that in a negative way, just in the reality of how these things operate, and that's going to be part of the decision making process. So I think that is an awesome point to hit on, which, you know, similarly when it comes to things that we're focusing on that aren't necessarily directly the hospital's problems, but indirectly align with that. Force number 4 that you have is alignment to competition. To help create urgency through essentially seeing what the competitive landscape is and being able to be aware of that in your conversation with these hospitals. So I'd love for you to, dive into that for the listeners.
Yeah, and I think 3 and 4 have some similarities, and so I know we were taught to pitch problems, right? And I get it, like, we have to show, "Here's a problem, I can solve that problem," but sometimes, I think it's great to pitch the ambitions, right? The CFO is
Mm,
trying to hit the 4% operating margin. The CEO wants to be known for making this systems region like a number 1 orthopedics center of excellence, right? So that speaks to competition. I think, and particularly in my area in South Florida, it's very competitive. And so they're looking to, let's talk about number of forces within competition. They've got to think about losing patients. How do they keep patients? How, if there's growth, is that is that hospital going to take the growth here? There's so many new hospitals coming into the area. I think competition is fierce in healthcare. And so how do you help your hospital, your hospitals address competition? So again, it could be in anything that's sold, really.
Yeah.
Or like, how do you help them improve the revenues? I have a client that that has a very similar, somewhat similar product in the marketplace, but there was a unique aspect. And my approach was, this is a revenue strategy. Like, let's show them how they could be unique in the marketplace, get more, drive more patients and make more money because there's some unique mechanisms to what they do in a somewhat of a generic area, and it landed. And so, like, how could you figure out, and maybe this isn't one of your forces, but I love alignment to competition if you can figure it out, because hospitals spend a lot of time with their strategy. This is a CEO element, this chief strategy officer, and they're looking for ways to grow, and they're looking to ways to protect. Sometimes, protect and grow. And so I love this area particularly.
100%. Well, I think this is also really relevant to reading the person you're talking with. For some people, this is going to be, especially if they're a competitive person, this is a big factor. I mean, in general, it's going to be a factor regardless of if they're a smart business person. But yeah, I think it hurts to look at someone who is a couple miles away and you can just see that they're outperforming what you're doing. So I think it's really smart to include
Yeah.
this, Lisa.
And I want to thank you. And I want to just mention one point. I don't think that we think enough about hospitals being in competition. I know I know it's somewhat obvious. Maybe driving down the road, you see a billboard, or there's numerous hospitals, like, oh, I could go here or here. But if you think about it, you said something earlier. These are people. Sometimes we have to remember we're selling to people. So we're selling to aspirations. We're selling to their competitive nature. They're selling to, I want to be the number one center of excellence. They all go to similar societies or groups,
Mm,
associations. They're people, like you said, but so that's why that one makes a whole lot of sense. And we're gearing up for the last one.
yeah, 100%. Which is alignment to the unique operational pressures that they are facing. Force number 5. Would love for you to, yeah, dive into how people can really strongly appeal to these and weave in their pitches. And maybe if you could even give an example of how you were able to successfully identify this, because I feel like that could be a tricky part with this, is also getting them to be honest enough and feel comfortable enough where you can accurately assess this. So yeah, I'd love to, just hear from you on force number 5 with your thoughts on it.
You nailed it, because I think this one's a tricky one, right? And so you really either have to be a sleuth, and even in
Mm,
doing some sleuth work, I don't know if you would always address it. So it does need to be other ways, maybe in conversations. But I think easy ways to understand this is that all the 4 forces we spoke about previously, I would say, addresses every hospital or ASC or in the same way, right?
yeah,
And in this 5th one, it's different because every hospital has its own community characteristics. That's what I would call it, right? So that community characteristic could be that they have a higher Medicaid population, or they have a really high private payer population. Or it could be a hospital that's located in a hurricane zone, right? Maybe,
yeah,
or a tornado zone, or so. Like, are there factors that they have to prepare for differently, right? It's not about the event that happens, like a hurricane or tornado. It's about their preparedness. How can you help them help them solve a problem in preparedness? One of the ways that I love to do this, of course, we can look at the Medicare cost report. We can look at a lot of these publicly available pieces of data that, some you can buy subscriptions to, but now with AI, actually, this is where I'll use Manus, Perplexity Computer, and they goes right out to a hospital's tax, the 1090, the taxes they have, the Medicare cost report, the state reports, and it goes out and finds things. And I'll ask like specific questions. And I've got specific prompts, and the data that comes back is fascinating. So I can understand their readmission rate for orthopedics or cardiac. I can understand a certificate of need is different in every state. So I just ran this, so I'm going to be speaking next week, and I ran it for Georgia. And just as to give an example, I have 4 pages of certificate of need data for Georgia that shows what hospitals are doing expansion projects, who
Yep.
are buying the biggest equipment. And so if you're able to see a year out, 2 years out on the plans of hospital, that's a
Mm,
unique pressure, because it's not that they're buying stuff. Well, now they're going to have staffing constraints. Maybe, what else goes into the pressures as they make those moves? And so that one's a real, like, to me, it's a gem, because I'll share it with people. Like, oh, I never thought of like the certificate or need. And
yeah.
in Florida in particular, we have a lot, like I looked at it for Florida, and there's like 30 new hospice centers opening up. Like, well, that's interesting. Like, what can you offer, or what can you provide, or what can you help them with? So that's, that's an alignment of a specific operational pressure, or, another one could be if the hospital got fined for whatever reason, now they have to pay a fine. If a hospital had a really big, let's say, Medicare penalty, like $1 million, $2 or $3 million, well, that's a pressure that you may be able to come in and relieve. But being aware of those things is real. I think it's really powerful.
100%. I mean, as you were talking within all that too about how, you can use AI in certain regards too. I'm even thinking like if I'm somebody who's like, this all sounds awesome, I'd like some help implementing it. Like obviously we're working on something that's going to make that a lot easier for people. But even in the interim, if someone were to take this transcript and give all their sales information to something like a chat GPT, a Claude, a Gemini, and be like, hey, audit this as if you're Lisa in this scenario too. Or even, hey, here's the 5 things to look out for. I want to do a deep research mode on this prospect I'm about to read on these 5 things of what you can find. Here's also my information on what I'm selling, the benefits. Here's the sales. Giving it that context, I think, yeah, people would really be able to apply what you're saying here in a very practical way for them, because a lot of this is really good. And I know people's big objection is always, oh, I just don't have enough time, you know?
Yeah, I never thought of that, right? You could literally take the transcript and put that in with their product, with information about myself, right? And how I would address it, and it would get them really further along. Like, how can I have 2 or 3 forces, or how can I think about it? And I think that's the goal of why I created, thanks to you, Gavin,
Thank you.
hospital sales AI, because I felt like, whether it's the 5 forces, and there's so many other aspects to the technology that will see people selling into healthcare tremendously, because it is healthcare focused. It's proven in, in methodologies that are successful, right? So it's not generic, it's specific too. So that's a great point. And I just want to thank you for a wonderful conversation too.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. If it's cool with you, I just have one last
Okay.
question,
Okay.
which is just out of these different 5 forces, what would you say is the number one that people most commonly misdiagnose? Yeah.
Wow, that's a good question. And for everyone listening, a lot of these I didn't have any warning on. So that's a good one, Gavin. Which one doesn't they get wrong? Which one they miss? Say that. That's a really good question. I would say, believe it or not, I think it's force 3. I think alignment to aspirations. I think we forget that people have they have goals that are set for them internally, right? So one of the things I used to say often to my team, and just, we'll find out what their cost savings goals are. Find out what, like, how can we help them? And people, we just have to ask the right questions. You said that earlier. It's true. I think that we missed that one, because if you're really, from a heart perspective or from a value perspective, if you value another human being and you want them to succeed, you're, you know, find ways to help your customers succeed from a true genuine perspective, them as a person. How can I help you, Gavin, succeed and give you value? And I think we don't lead with enough of that. If I think that's the one they miss.
No, that's awesome. It reminds me of the Zig Ziglar quote of if you help people get what they want, then you'll get what you want. So
That's
I know
right.
you're a busy woman. I know you got to bounce here for another call. This was an amazing conversation. Lisa, I think people are going to get a lot out of it. And thank you so much.
This was fantastic, Gavin. And can you just tell everybody where they can find you, because you do a lot of this and you do PR and you're exceptional at it. And one of the reasons why I'm probably showing up in a lot more places is because of you. So can you give a little bit of your information?
I appreciate that. Yeah, the best way to get in contact with me would be my email, which is just gavin@empathyfirm.com. Or check me out on Instagram as well if you're looking to stay connected on social, which is just Gavin period Lira Lira. But thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that so much.
Thank you. All right, Gavin. Talk soon. Bye.